Hello, welcome to Train Signal. You're watching this lesson on paravirtual SCSI adapters. In this lesson, you'll be learning what a paravirtual SCSI adapter is and how it provides faster storage throughput for your virtual machines. We'll be covering the specific requirements for using paravirtual SCSI adapters, as well as the limitations when using it, and show you how to set it up and configure it. Finally, we will cover some tips and best practices for using paravirtual SCSI adapters, including when you should consider using them and when you should stick with the other storage adapter types instead. Paravirtualization refers to virtual hardware that is presented to VMs that is similar but not identical to that of the underlying hardware. Paravirtualization uses a special operating system driver to communicate with the hypervisor. The paravirtual SCSI adapter is a misleading term, as all virtual hardware is considered paravirtual because the hypervisor presents certain virtual hardware to a VM and does the translation to the actual hardware in the VM kernel. In earlier ESX releases such as VI3, the only VM storage adapters available to a VM were emulated versions of hardware storage adapters from Bus Logic and LSI Logic. The new paravirtual SCSI adapter introduced in vSphere is performance optimized specifically for virtual environments and not based on a physical adapter design. The paravirtual SCSI adapter uses a special driver to communicate directly with the hypervisor to provide maximum performance. Paravirtual SCSI adapters are similar to VM DirectPath as they both bypass a virtualization monitor, but a PV SCSI adapter can be shared by multiple VMs on a host, where you must dedicate an adapter to a VM with VM DirectPath. In testing PV SCSI adapters versus the standard LSI Logic adapter, VMware has seen improvements in both disk throughput and CPU efficiency. In particular, PV SCSI adapters provide the most benefit for CPU efficiency no matter what type of storage is used. The amount of CPU efficiency is greatest for smaller I/O sizes and tapers off above 32 kilobytes. So you might be wondering, when should you decide to use PV SCSI adapters? If they're so great, why not use them all the time? VMware has done testing on this and has found that for low I/O workloads, the LSI Logic adapter is so efficient that there is no need to use PV SCSI to improve efficiency. The CPU efficiency difference between the two at low IOPS levels is so small that it's insignificant. However, when there are very high IOPS levels, like around 10,000 to 15,000 IOPS, the CPU efficiency is much greater. As a result of VMware's testing, they have found that PV SCSI is better than LSI Logic, except under one condition where the virtual machine is performing less than 2,000 IOPS and issuing greater than 4 outstanding IOs. Therefore, it is recommended to use PV SCSI adapters only for applications that have high disk I/O requirements. This diagram depicts the normal binary translation method that is used by the LSI Logic and Bus Logic storage adapters, and the method used by the paravirtual SCSI adapter. The binary translation method has the guest OS and the non-privileged CPU ring 1, and all calls to the storage adapter must go through ring 0, where the virtual machine monitor resides, which results in an extra layer that must be traveled through and a slight I/O penalty. With the paravirtualization method, the adapter resides in ring 0, where the virtualization layer is, and can directly access the hardware without the need for translation, which results in better performance. The requirements for PV SCSI adapters are pretty simple. PV SCSI adapters are only supported on Windows 2003 and 2008 and Red Hat Enterprise Linux version 5 virtual machines. They can be used with any type of storage, including Fiber Channel, hardware and software iSCSI, and NFS. They can also be used with direct attached storage, but VMware does not recommend it because there is not much benefit to it. It's also required that the virtual machine hardware be version 7, which is a default in vSphere. There are a few limitations for PV SCSI adapters. When vSphere 4.0 was first released, they were only supported for use with non-boot operating system disks. So you had to use a regular LSI Logic or Bus Logic virtual SCSI adapter for the boot disk of a VM, and add an additional disk using the PV SCSI adapter for your applications. Beginning with vSphere 4.0 Update 1, this changed, and you can now use PV SCSI adapters for boot disks, but only on Windows 2003 and 2008 VMs. Red Hat Enterprise Linux version 5 still does not support using PV SCSI adapters for boot disks. The fault tolerance feature cannot be used with VMs that have PV SCSI adapters. When doing a disk hot add or removing a disk, it requires a bus rescan from within the guest. Disks with snapshots might not experience performance gains when using PV-SCSI adapters, or if memory on the ESX host is overcommitted and physical host memory is exhausted. Because the default type of newly hot added SCSI adapters depends on the type of primary boot SCSI controller, hot adding a PV-SCSI adapter is not supported. You can add a PV-SCSI adapter either when creating a VM or afterwards. To add one when you create a new VM, you must choose the custom wizard type. You must also choose Virtual Machine Hardware version 7. If you are using a PV-SCSI adapter for your boot disk on Windows 2003 and 2008, be aware that they do not include the special OS driver needed to use the adapter and consequently will not see the disk when you try and install the OS. As a result, you will need to tell Windows to use a special driver disk during the installation. Fortunately, VMware has made this easy. Beginning with version 4.0 Update 1, they have included the drivers on a floppy image located in the VM Images folder that is installed by default on all ESX hosts. The PV-SCSI adapter driver is also installed as part of VMware Tools, so if you add a PV-SCSI adapter after a VM has the guest OS installed, the driver will already be there. To use a PV-SCSI adapter when creating a new VM, you must choose a custom wizard type. You must also choose Virtual Machine Hardware version 7. Let's look at a demonstration of adding a PV-SCSI adapter to a new VM. Okay, we're now going to see how to create a new VM with a PV-SCSI adapter. You select our host, select New Virtual Machine. That launches the new Virtual Machine configuration wizard. There are two types of options here that you can choose from, the typical and the custom. You need to select custom to be able to select the PV-SCSI adapter. You see here when you select custom, there are some new options that are shown once you select that option. The one we need is SCSI controller. When you select typical, you don't have those options, and then by default it uses the LSI Logic SCSI adapter. So we select custom, continue through the wizard, give our VM a name, select next, select the data store for the virtual machine. Now here we must choose Virtual Machine version 7 because the PV-SCSI adapters are not supported on the older version 4, which is used with ESX3X. Choose your operating system. Again, you must select Windows 2003 or 2008 or Red Hat Enterprise Linux version 5 because that's all that's supported with the PV-SCSI adapters. Select your CPUs, your memory, your network. Now here's where we choose the PV-SCSI adapter. You'll see here you have a couple options. The default is the LSI Logic Parallel. The VMware Paravirtual is the PV-SCSI adapter. So we select that, say next, create our disk, and here's some advanced options that you don't have to set, and then ready to complete. That creates our new VM with a PV-SCSI adapter. Now remember that the driver for PV-SCSI adapters on new VMs are not included inside of Windows, so you basically have to tell Windows to use a special driver disk when you're installing Windows, and we'll show you that a little bit later. To add a PV-SCSI adapter to an existing VM, you can edit the VM settings while the VM is either powered on or off. You can then add a hard disk, and on the Advanced Options screen, select the SCSI device node that the first number is different from your existing hard disk. For example, your existing hard disk may be 0:1. You want to select 1:0, which tells it to add another adapter and not use the existing adapter. Finally, you select the new SCSI controller that is added, click Change Type, and then select VMware Paravirtual. We'll now demonstrate how to add a PV-SCSI adapter to an existing VM. We select our VM, select Edit Settings. Now you'll see this VM already has a SCSI controller and a hard disk. The existing SCSI controller is an LSI Logic Parallel. It's got an existing disk attached to it. What we're going to be doing is adding a second SCSI controller. That's going to be the PV-SCSI adapter, and a second disk to go along with that. We look here at this disk and we'll note that the SCSI ID on this disk is 0:0. That means the controller is the first 0, and the device number of the disk is the second 0. So what we want to do is choose a SCSI ID that's going to add a second controller to the VM. And to do that, we want to select 1:0, which will tell it to add another SCSI controller. So we go up to Add, select Hard Disk, create a new virtual disk, give it a size. You can also specify things like thin provisioning. Select Next. Now here's where we're going to change the SCSI virtual device node. If we go with 0:1, that's going to use the existing adapter, which is already an LSI logic adapter. We want to add a VMware Paravirtual adapter as a second adapter, so we're going to choose 1:0. You see here all these numbers listed. The first number, like I said, is the controller number. Each controller can support up to 15 devices. Once we get to the end here and say 1:0, it's going to add a new controller for the hard disk that we're creating right now. So we say Next, click Finish. Now we have a new disk, but by default it made it an LSI Logic parallel adapter. So what we want to do is click on that, go up here to Change Type, select VMware Paravirtual, select OK. So now we have a second controller for that second hard disk, which is the VMware PV-SCSI adapter. And we just say OK, and that's it. That VM now has a second disk using the PV-SCSI adapter. If you wish to change the adapter type on an existing VM to a PV-SCSI adapter, you should ensure that VMware Tools is installed first, as the driver for the PV-SCSI adapter will already be installed. If you do not do this, you will not be able to boot the VM, as the driver will be missing. Once VMware Tools is installed, power off the VM and edit its settings. Next, select the existing SCSI controller and click the Change Type button. Finally, select the VMware Paravirtual type and click OK. We'll now demonstrate how to change the adapter type on an existing VM. Select your VM, select Edit Settings, select the SCSI controller. You see right now it's using the LSI Logic Parallel controller. You want to click the Change Type button, select VMware Paravirtual, click OK, and that's it. Easy as that. Now remember that if you do not have VMware Tools installed on an existing VM already, that VM probably won't boot because the driver is missing. So always make sure that you have VMware Tools installed first before you do this. After you add a PV-SCSI adapter to new VM and install Windows, you will need to tell Windows to use a specific driver, otherwise Windows will not see any disks as the PV-SCSI driver is not included in the Windows installation. To do this, during the Windows installation, press F6 when prompted to use a third-party SCSI driver at the beginning of the Windows installation. Next, you want to edit the VM settings, select the floppy drive, and choose the Use Existing Flopping Image in Data Store option for the device type. What we are doing is loading a floppy image file that contains the device driver on the VM's virtual floppy drive, so we can point Windows to the PV-SCSI adapter driver. Next, click the Browse button and select the VM Images folder in the Browse Data Stores list. Then select the Floppies folder and select the appropriate Windows 2003 or Windows 2008 PV-SCSI floppy image. Finally, put a check mark by Connected in the Device Data section and click OK. We now have the driver loaded on the virtual floppy drive, so Windows can access it. Once we have the PV-SCSI adapter driver loaded on the virtual floppy drive of the VM, back in Windows, when the appropriate screen appears, press S to specify an additional device driver, then press Enter when prompted to insert a floppy disk containing the PV-SCSI driver. The VMware PV-SCSI controller will be displayed and highlighted. Press Enter to select it, and then press Enter to continue the Windows installation as you normally would. We'll now look at a demonstration of installing Windows with the PV-SCSI adapter. We have a VM here that has the VMware Paravirtual PV-SCSI adapter as its main controller. We're now going to install Windows Server 2003 on here. So we're going to power on the VM, and when the VM comes on, right away you'll probably see a message that says press F6 to load a specific device driver. Once that appears, you want to hit F6 right away, so we'll get prompted later on for a location of that driver. So let's power the VM on. Right here you see press F6, so let's do that. And what that's going to do is later on prompt us now for a specific driver location. Right here we want to push S to specify an additional device. But before we do that, we need to load the virtual floppy drive with that device image. So we're now going to go up to VM, Edit Settings, and select the floppy drive. We're going to say Use Existing Floppy Image in Data Store. Click the Browse button. Now you see a VM Images folder. This folder exists on every ESX host. It's where the VMware Tools images are installed, and also the floppy images for SCSI drivers. So now we select the floppies folder. That's where the drivers are located in. And you'll see here a couple PV-SCSI drivers. One for 2003, one for 2008. Because we're installing Windows Server 2003, we want to select the 2003 floppy driver. Now we also need to say connected here, because it's not going to be connected and we say that. Next we say OK. Okay, now the virtual floppy drive of the VM has that driver loaded inside of it. So now we can go ahead here and say ask to specify an additional device. It's asking us to please insert the floppy disk, and it's already inserted because it's in the virtual floppy drive. So now we want to press enter to continue. And there it is. It found the VMware PV-SCSI controller. That's the driver. So now we just press enter to select that. And now enter to continue. We don't need any more drivers. You'll see there it's going to load that driver. And that's it. It is continuing with the Windows installation as you normally would. And it's now going to be able to see the disks, where if you continue here, if you didn't load that driver, Windows would complain right away that there's no disks to load Windows onto. But now that we have that driver installed, it found the disk, and now we can install Windows as we normally would. Here are some tips and best practices for using Paravirtual SCSI adapters with your VMs. First, only use PV-SCSI adapters for medium to high disk I/O workloads, and use LSI logic adapters for lower disk I/O workloads. You may be tempted to use them for all your VMs, but you are better off only using them for VMs with workloads that will benefit from them. Remember, the LSI logic adapter performs better with lower I/O workloads. If you aren't sure about the disk I/O that your VM is generating, look at the disk performance data in the vSphere client to see how much disk I/O is occurring. It's okay to use LSI logic adapters for a VM's boot disk and a separate PV-SCSI adapter for the disk that will store application data. Doing this will benefit the VM's performance by having two separate I/O devices on two different disks. If you upgrade from Red Hat Enterprise Linux version 5 to a kernel that is not supported by vSphere, you might not be able to access the data on the virtual machine's PV-SCSI disks. You can run the VMware config tools.pl Perl script with the kernel-version parameter to regain access. On Windows servers, before changing the SCSI controller type to VMware Paravirtual, always make absolutely certain that VMware Tools is installed, or the VM will not be able to boot. If this happens, you can change the adapter type back to the original type, install VMware Tools, and then change it to a PV-SCSI adapter. Here are some key terms that you should know that are related to PV-SCSI adapters. Paravirtualization refers to virtual hardware that is presented to VMs that is similar but not identical to that of the underlying physical hardware. IOPS stands for Input-Output Operations per Second and is a common storage benchmarking measurement used by utilities such as Iometer. Bus logic and LSI logic are popular emulated storage adapter types used in VMware and they are based on actual physical storage adapters. These adapters have existed in VMware across many different versions. Here are some links for more information about PV-SCSI adapters that show the performance benefits of PV-SCSI adapters as well as when to use them. In addition, there is also a link for a white paper that explains the concepts of para-virtualization, which is what virtualization is all about. PV-SCSI adapters can provide VMs with greatly improved disk I/O throughput and can help with applications that have very high I/O requirements. Disk throughput is often a bottleneck in virtual environments, and PV-SCSI adapters can really benefit your VMs in that area. In this lesson, we have learned how to use PV-SCSI adapters so you can take advantage of the disk I/O performance improvement that it offers to virtual machines. That concludes this lesson on PV-SCSI adapters. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.